Good evening, and welcome to Where's the Party? The new challenge of political parties. A conversation with William Fernekes about his new book, Clifford Case and the Challenges of Liberal Republicanism. My name is Elizabeth Matto, and I'm a research professor and the director of the Eagleton Institute of Politics. In 1980, the Rutgers Board of Governors voted to establish the Clifford P. Case Professorship of Public Affairs to honor Senator Case's distinguished career by bringing respected public servants, to Rutgers University to speak to students and the general public. Over the years, the Eagleton Institute of Politics has been honored to welcome such public servants as Gerald Ford, Tip O'Neill, Governor Tom Kean, and Hillary Clinton to serve as the Clifford P. Case Professor. And the lecture series was a fitting tribute to a public servant, and continues to be a fitting tribute to a public servant who was lauded as someone who always put principle over party and who governed with an abiding sense of integrity. After serving in local office and state office, Clifford Case represented the state of New Jersey in the House of Representatives from 1944 to 1953, and then represented New Jersey in the United States Senate from 1954 until 1978, until he was defeated in the GOP primary. And as our guest points out, no Republican has held the New Jersey Senate seat for over 40 years. And so it's a noteworthy accomplishment, given that registered Democrats far outnumber registered Republicans throughout the state. So what was it then, not only about Senator Clifford Case, but about the Republican Party at the time, that helps us understand this phenomenon? And so that's going to be our focus this evening in our conversation, an exploration of the changing roles of political parties and the implications for democracy, by focusing specifically on the service of Senator Clifford Case. There's much to be shared about our guest this evening, William Fernekes, Bill Fernekes. Bill taught social studies and Spanish from 1974 until 1987 at Hunterdon and Central Regional High School here in New Jersey. And he served as the supervisor of social studies at Hunterdon and Central from 1987 until he retired in 2010. Bill has his doctorate in social studies education and curriculum, earned it in 1985. And he's published on a variety of subjects, but has published widely in the fields of the Holocaust and genocide studies, human rights education, issue-centered social studies education, and more. The book that he's going to be discussing this evening, Clifford Case and the Challenge of Liberal Republicanism, is actually the result of 20 years of meticulous research and writing, and was published by Lexington Books in August of 2023. Bill currently teaches courses in global education rights, human rights and education at the Rutgers Graduate School of Education here at Rutgers. So throughout our conversation, we want to encourage all of you, welcome all of you to submit your questions in the Q&A prompt. And after about 40 minutes or so, we'll look to your Q&A, look to your questions and involve them and bring them into our conversation. So thank you all for joining us. I want to start, Bill, by just, when I first got to know you, when you and I first worked together, it was when you were the social studies supervisor at Hunterdon and Central. And although this is a biography, a work of political history, I would imagine in many ways for you, you're a civic educator at heart, as I am. And so I'm wondering, when you're thinking about the research you did, the discussions you've been holding about Senator Case, what civic lessons might we learn from Senator Clifford Case? What can his service teach us about democratic citizenship?
Well, thank you very much, Elizabeth, for being the moderator of this webinar. And so what a great opportunity and an honor to be here tonight. I would say there are three important lessons that we can start with. First of all, I think Case's career demonstrated you can be civil and kind in political discourse. He was highly regarded for his integrity and his honesty and his respect for opposing viewpoints. I think there is no imperative to be mean-spirited and cruel when trying to do the best for the American people. That's one lesson, I would say. I'd say a second one is that democracy requires deliberation, and getting things done means the thoughtful exchange of competing views with the goal of doing what is best for the public. Case was only rarely in the majority, and his success as a legislator relied on his ability to work with others and to develop coalitions. That ensured buy-in and passage of legislation that reflected a broad understanding of the public's needs. And I would say a third lesson is that high standards of ethical behavior and a commitment to integrity in all aspects of one's public life mean a great deal. Case fought long and hard to raise ethical standards in the Senate and eventually prevailed during his final year in the Senate when Jimmy Carter signed the Government Ethics Act, and he had advocated this financial disclosure for 20 years. The voters knew Clifford Case could not be bought. And I think you should know that any gift sent to his office was returned. They accepted no gifts. It doesn't matter if it was a coffee cake or anything else, they wouldn't accept it, and they returned it.
Wow. And
I think that's very important because it set a high standard of ethics not only to the public, but when I interviewed Christine Todd Whitman for the book, she said that atmosphere in the office was pervasive. It was serious, it was good humor, but everybody knew that there were lines that would not be crossed.
Set a tone for his office, for those who interact with in New Jersey and in Washington, D.C. Interesting. Let's start to talk about the subject at hand, political parties, and sure, what his service reflected about the state of parties then, how we can contrast that with the state of political parties today. Party polarization, political polarization, as social scientists, as political scientists, we measure it in a number of ways. One indicator we look at is the extent to which there is any ideological common ground. For example, are there a number of issues we can find where Democrats and Republicans can come to some sort of consensus or common ground? We look at things such as votes in legislation or on nominees, for example, and to see the extent to which we see elected officials crossing party lines, or is there pure uniformity? And, certainly we have seen, look, over the years, most recently, a number of these measures indicating that partisan polarization is on the rise. And today, as we're coming into this conversation, any conversations related to parties, at least today on the national level, we're looking at the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, latest threats by a small pocket of members of the Republican Party to oust him for what some have characterized as compromising with the Democrats. Here in New Jersey, there's a lot of discussion right now about the county party line and the role of party leaders in New Jersey. There's always a discussion about the role of third parties. So much of our conversations about parties revolve around one or two of these themes. Let's start by having you share with us Case's views on the two-party system, the maintenance of the two-party system. What were his thoughts on the two-party system? What importance did he place on having a vital, vibrant two-party system in the United States?
Well, Clifford Case was not a man to reject political parties. He never ran as an independent. In fact, after he lost the primary to Jeffrey Bell in June 1978, a number of people approached him about it. He said, absolutely not. He believed that the two-party system was a bulwark of American politics. Now, having said that, he had quite a few times when he disagreed with the power structure in the Republican Party in New Jersey and on the national level with, for example, Barry Goldwater. I think it's important to keep in mind that Clifford Case never strayed from being a Republican. And while some people called him a Democrat in sheep's clothing, for lack of a better term, and that's my phrase, but I'm sort of characterizing how they looked at him because he had a very liberal voting record. Mm-hmm. He viewed himself as effectively, I think, an heir to the Lincoln Republican Party. Now, if we think about the history of the Republican Party, Clifford Case, even in the 1930s, defined himself as a liberal Republican. When many Republicans, as you know, rejected the New Deal out of hand, they viewed the entire Franklin Roosevelt administration as a march to socialism or things of that sort. Well, Case was never like that. He viewed the Republican Party as a big tent. And he felt that there had to be room for all points of view, which put him at odds with, I would say, the very conservative elements in the Republican Party. But he felt that the two-party system was essential for the maintenance of democracy. And one of the things he did in the 1950s, after he was elected to the Senate, he wrote a very interesting piece about modern republicanism, and it was published in the New York Times Magazine. Now, this was a phrase that actually he and Eisenhower were very much in sync on. The idea that the Republican Party, if it was going to maintain, you might say, a major role in American politics, could not simply reject everything that the New Deal had done because they had been out of power. Let's just remember, the Republican Party was out of power in the presidency from 1932 to 1952.
Right.
And Eisenhower, who was not a politically active person in most of his life, he was a military man, I think he was savvy. He recognized that you're not going to be able to sustain any power as a political party if you continue to reject things and try to go back to the 19th century. Case believed in that. And he also felt that the Republican Party needed to recognize and what he called common sense solutions about staying to the center of the political spectrum. And I think that's one of the reasons he was so disappointed with the Goldwater attitude. You might say, once Goldwater got the nomination and Goldwater moved so far to the right and was refusing, for example, to repudiate the John Birch Society, voted against the Civil Rights Act, Case felt that really was moving away from the center and that the only way the Republican Party was going to be able to stay vibrant was to reject extremism.
Was that, I mean, if I could go a little deeper on that, because so now it's April, but our two presidential nominees have been determined for quite some time, and there were real risks for Republicans to speak out against the Trump nomination.
Mm-hmm.
What were the risks for Clifford Case, or were the risks different? Were there any risks? First of all, what were the risks, and were they not nearly? Are they more pronounced today than they were for Clifford Case?
Well, I think if we look at Case's own election to the Senate, which was extremely close, his election in 1954 was close to being undone by conservative Republicans in the state who wanted him to lose. And that was a serious threat. In 1960, when he ran for re-election, he had to face another conservative threat by Robert Morris, who had worked with Joseph McCarthy and was a very far-right Republican, and he crushed that threat. So after the 1960 primary, Case was really, I think, very much more powerful in terms of New Jersey politics. However, when he got to Goldwater in 1964, the situation in the San Francisco convention was rather difficult. I mean, Tom Kean and I, when I interviewed him, talked about this, that there was a real air of racism. There was the convention was dominated by Goldwater supporters. They rejected a civil rights plank in the Republican platform. And I think Case felt that this was not the way to go, but he was not necessarily, his electability was not necessarily threatened. But he always had people in New Jersey, I would say a declining number over the years, who felt that he was way out of touch with the GOP. He was too liberal. He voted for too many things on the Johnson administration, and he didn't toe the line. And by the way, Clifford Case refused the offer of becoming the minority whip in the Senate for one reason alone. He said, "I do not want to sacrifice my independence."
Interesting. Let's talk a little bit, and you started to mention it, but I actually want to reference a quote that you mentioned at the start of chapter 20 from a lecture that Senator Case gave here at the Eagleton Institute of Politics. Not certain if it was in this room. I'm in the library here at the Eagleton Institute, but he was here in 1979 and cautioned about the decline in political parties and stated, "I don't think it's a good thing when people get a party nomination without the support of an organization." You know, there's been a lot of research in political science about what's referred to as the rise in candidate-centered politics. So let's talk a little bit about that. In what ways did he represent the vestiges or the last vestiges of the old party system, which dominated the nomination process, which controlled the nomination process and the election of candidates? What was the value of such a system? Was there a value to having a system such as that really was replaced, dismantled with the McGovern Commission 1972? Am I right about that, Bill? Where you have the beginnings of these direct primary systems. But let's talk about that.
Sure. I mean, I think Clifford Case had, for lack, an ambivalent relationship with the party system. He felt parties were important. He believed that party organizations were important, but he didn't believe that they could slavishly expect candidates to agree with everything they wanted. And that's one of the reasons, by the way, that he set up his own fundraising operation. He did not want to rely on the state Republican committee to fund his campaign. So he had his own committee for Senator Case. And that was an important thing for him because he felt he needed to be independent and make his own decisions without having to sort of bow down to money. But to get back to your point about the issue of parties, I think you see in the 1960s, and it develops much more into the 70s, the idea that parties are less important than celebrity. Candidates become selected not necessarily because they're party supporters or because they have a particular ideological perspective within the party. They're people who are elected or chosen because they rose outside the party. I mean, Bill Bradley is a perfect example of that. When the 19 election, when he ran against Bell in 78, he was not the party's choice. Richard Leone was the party's choice for Brendan Byrne, right? Jeffrey Bell's another one. He wasn't the establishment choice in 78 either. Yeah. But I also think that when you look at parties today, I think they've become much, much weaker than they used to be. And I don't think Case, by the way, was a big supporter of machine politics. Don't get me wrong. I don't think he would have supported a Frank Hague machine or anything like that. He actually was very much in support of the clean government campaign in New Jersey, led by Vanderbilt in the 30s and 40s. But he believed that party organizations meant something, and that was important. He often, campaigned for candidates all up and down the ballot. Municipal, county, state legislative, and things like that. And in fact, I think one of the things that's a result of the loss of political party organization is that we no longer have contested conventions. We no longer have conventions that actually mean anything.
Right. Interesting. You referenced this earlier about Clifford Case's resistance to extremism. And his desire to be searching for bipartisan solutions when it came to legislative problems, political problems, rejecting extremism from both the left and the right.
Yes.
You write in your chapter on his first term in the Senate that Case believed the American electorate was practical, compassionate, optimistic, and opposed to strident expressions of either liberalism or conservatism. Can you give us a few examples of how that manifested in his career? How did his approach to finding bipartisan solutions manifest in his career? Okay,
well, I can go back even before the Senate, when he's in the House.
Right.
He proposed, it was the last member of the House before the most recent development and passage of a law on anti-lynching legislation at the federal level, which was only 2 years ago. He was the last member of the House to propose anti-lynching legislation, which by definition was going to be opposed by Southern Democrats. Now, as a Republican, he also faced opposition from conservative Republicans on that, but he had to build a coalition in support of that bill, even to get it to the floor. Right. So that's a good example, I think. But then you go to the Senate, and I think you see that when he gets into the Senate, one of the key pieces of legislation that comes up is the 1957 Civil Rights Bill. And the Republicans are in the minority. And at that point, Lyndon Johnson is running the show in the Senate. Well, Clifford Case is all in on getting a vigorous civil rights bill passed. He was actually quite disappointed with the final result. But he supported that bill and saw that as an overriding priority for the country. And then when you go to the 1960s and you see what happens in the Kennedy and Johnson administrations, then you really see the idea of bipartisanship going full flower, you might say. I mean, if you look at Congressional Quarterly's analysis of whether the person votes with the majority of their party or not, Clifford Case often voted, I would say, less than 40% of the time with the rest of the Republicans in the Senate, because he believed that the legislation that was going through was better for the country, and he didn't slavishly sort of support the party, but he worked very hard on that. And then, of course, I think one of the most important efforts of his bipartisanship was his work to end the Vietnam War.
Bill, you mentioned when you were looking through the numbers of, the extent to which he voted in a bipartisan way. Was he an outlier then among Republicans, would you say, or were there other Republicans that maybe
there were other Republicans,
similarly?
but they tended to be liberal Republicans like him, Jacob Javits and Charles Mathias and people like that. And that group, interestingly enough, does no longer exist.
Yeah.
And people today, I think, have a hard time even conceptualizing the idea that there were liberal Republicans. But that was, frankly, one of the reasons I wanted the book to be written, because we need to understand the importance of that group in the Republican Party from the post-war period up until about 1980.
Yeah. And it's worth a reminder that if you're listening and you'd like to ask a question, please feel free to submit a question in the Q&A. Want to just on this question of bipartisanship, it's also everyone check out the foreword by Professor Ross Baker from Rutgers University, who really is an expert in the study of the Senate, the practice of the Senate. He spent a lot of time in Senate offices. He also brings up, Bill, the Case Church Amendment and
Yes.
related to the war in Vietnam. I don't know if you want to talk about, even just referencing in his foreword, just the fact that you had a bipartisan, that you had a Republican and a Democrat co-authoring this amendment is also a noteworthy accomplishment and reflection of his approach to bipartisanship.
Well, I think the other thing that many people today, unless they study this history, don't understand is how unified the Congress was on so many issues in foreign policy at that time. Mm-hmm. And during Vietnam, I think that bipartisan effort ended up in two ways. There was a bipartisan support of the war, and then a gradual bipartisan opposition to the war. And Case, as I mentioned in the book, was not a person who rapidly changed his mind. I mean, he was a strong supporter of containment. He was a strong supporter of anti-communism. But after that trip to Vietnam in 1967, he really saw what he felt was a serious credibility gap. And it was interesting to look at the actual Senate hearings, because at the outset, his questions sort of are an outlier. And William Fulbright is running these hearings. They're on television. But over time, they sort of shift over to Case's view about questioning the administration and challenging the ideas of what they're talking about, and challenging Nixon's Vietnamization process and so-called peace with honor. And then he really works hard, I think, over a period of effectively 3 or 4 years to make an amendment effectively get passed that would cut the funding off the war, because they had tried everything before that. And they finally realized the only way you were going to stop this was cut off the money. And it wouldn't have passed unless he and Church had worked cooperatively. I spoke to John Marks, who was his staff assistant. He said he and Tom Dean, who was a staff member for Church, they'd have lunch every day. They'd keep going back, one disappointment after, they'd just go back and work on another one. Mm.
So obviously, one of the reasons we're having this conversation is to compare and contrast, look at how things used to be, how are things today. So, we know, as we've referenced here in this conversation, as you're reading the book, which I encourage everyone to do, plenty of instances where there was that opportunity to find common ground, whether it was civil rights, the environment, war in Vietnam. Can we envision, let's be optimists here, are there goodness knows there are plenty of pressing issues facing the country currently.
Sure.
Any that you would identify as possible starting points for identifying common ground between the Republican Democratic Party?
I thought that was an excellent question when you sent it off, and I thought a lot about it. Well, here are some topics I think could generate a real bipartisan approach. One is poverty. And I think there's a bill that's being considered right now about restoring the child tax credit, which is a good starting point for that. And it has bipartisan support. It's being held up in the Senate by one person, but I think it actually will pass if they can get past that one person. I would say hunger of children in the country, which is tied to poverty. I think women's health care would be a very strong bipartisan effort. I don't see that as being an ideological problem. I think that could be something where they could come together. Also, I believe on environmental protection. Now, I realize that some people on the right and the conservative movement see that as an overreach, but I think the conversation has changed on that, and there's an enormous amount of evidence, and I think public support for that. Let me also say that I think there are some serious national security issues where there would be strong bipartisan consensus. We see it in some ways, I think, and I think I'm hopeful that the bill will pass in the next few days about the foreign aid supplemental with Ukraine and China and so forth, and Taiwan and Israel. But I think on national security, anti-terrorism, and I also, and this sounds like a stretch, but I actually do think there is an opportunity to generate immigration policy reform after the election, because I think the nominee of the Republican Party is far too wedded as an obstructionist. But I do think there's enough interest on the Republican side and the Democratic side to make something happen in both parts of the Congress.
And there looks to be even there was some movement on that issue before the nominee had made a public statement about it. As I referenced in my introduction, and certainly you've reflected that it's been reflected in your comments, Case's voting record consistently showed a willingness to support legislation that, even if it was opposed by the majority of Republicans, if he felt like it was going to benefit the country as a whole, he was willing, to support the legislation, even if he was outweighed by the rest of the Republican. How do we account for this? First of all, how did he justify his record, and how have political conditions made that challenging today?
I'm going to handle the last part first, because I think it sets an interesting context. Clifford Case was a man who believed in thoughtful deliberation. He would be appalled today by the 24-hour news cycle, by the constant efforts to have a political position or something put in 120 characters. I think he would be just appalled by it, because that was not who he was. He believed in thoughtful deliberation. In fact, when you talk to his staff members, they said every week when they had a staff meeting, he wanted to hear all points of view, not those that he agreed with, all of them. And then he would only then consider making a decision, because he wanted to know everything. Also, his Sam Zagoria, who was his first administrative assistant, said he knew when he went into the office, the first hour Case was in the office, nobody would interrupt him, because he had to read The Economist, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Washington Post. Wow. So here's a person who's well informed, he's thoughtful. And knowing that, I think we have to keep in mind that of his upbringing too. He had a strong sense of concern for the most vulnerable in society. And I think his father's example was very significant with that. But I think he also felt very deeply that part of the role of government was to restrain people from engaging in destructive conflicts and to support those who didn't have the power. So I think when he saw something where he could do that, for example, he was a strong supporter of the federal lunch program. He was a strong supporter of giving foreign aid, because he felt it was not only in the national interest, but in the interest of humanity to do this. And so I think when you look at the man, and you look at what he stood for, it was reflected in what he believed in. And I think the other thing about him was that, and this was very interesting in some of the comments that were made in the memorial after his death, when published in the Congressional Record and so forth, and in editorials. They said that here was a man who was a decent person, but he would never go to the point of using a wounding or cruel gesture against anyone. He wouldn't make comments like that. I mean, that's so obviously different today that I think it's a sad commentary actually on our politics. But that's who the man was, and I believe that he saw the party as subservient to the country. And a good example of this, by the way, was in his last year. He voted for the Panama Canal Treaty, knowing, I should do 2 treaties, knowing it would hurt him in the primary.
There's a quote that you reference from him that I think was found in the Central Jersey Home News, in which Senator Clifford Case stated, "Politics is the job of helping people meet their problems, keeping them from destroying each other, checking their bad instincts, and encouraging their good ones." So it says a lot, I think, about what he saw as the value, the good of, there was that politics was good, or that there was value in politics and democratic politics, lowercase d, democratic politics.
And that government can be a force for good.
Yeah.
He rejected Goldwater's ideology that the least government is the best, because he didn't believe it worked. He felt that, if you're going to end the obstacles to voting, the federal government had to take a role. Because, when he entered the House, he was reluctant initially to advocate an aggressive federal role. But when he saw that nothing was getting done at the state level, he said, well, the federal government has got to intervene. This has to happen. And over time, he became much more willing to do that, especially on the environment, for example.
So we have a number of questions that have come in. I will encourage people to continue to submit their questions. We're going to get to them in a moment. Can I just take a little segue here, Bill? And you've referenced a number of interviews that you did. And as I mentioned, the research you really did meticulous research and about a 20-year process of engaging in the research and doing the writing. Can you give us a little sense about a little bit about the nature of your research?
Sure.
It sounds as if there was you did a number of one-on-one interviews. I know just in conversations you and I have had, you gathered a lot of primary documents, did a good deal of traveling to presidential libraries. So can you share with all of us a little bit about your research process?
Sure. I mean, when you get into something like this, it's you have no idea how much you're actually going to find. I think Robert Caro has actually said this, that in his long and wonderful books on Lyndon Johnson, which are still not, the last one's still not out, he made a comment that he used about 10% of what he found.
Wow.
I think that's fair, because I have enormous amount of sources I couldn't use because of the limitations that the publisher had on the total word count. And that's okay. That's okay. I think actually they were right. A shorter book and a more concise book would made the point. But in terms of the process, it's a detective story, right? You have a path, you start following, you start seeing things in secondary sources, you start pursuing them. Rutgers has 350 boxes of cases papers. I went through them, probably most of them. But then you have to get other perspectives, and that's when you start looking at presidential libraries. I mean, I went to Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon. And as an advertisement, by the way, staff of the National Archives is outstanding. And anybody who's advocating cutting the budget of the National Archives, I vote no. They're terrific.
Ditto.
But the other thing about it is that there's an enormous wealth of material in government documents, the congressional record, the hearings. And luckily, when the pandemic hit, by the way, all of that is available on the internet now.
Yeah.
The entire historical congressional record is available, which would have made my job much more difficult if I couldn't do that. But I think that as you go through the process, you find things that are interesting but not central to the argument. I'll give you an example. Case and Jacob Javits were very significant in developing congressional support for a resolution to the Rhodesia crisis in the Carter administration. It's a great story, but it didn't fit because there wasn't enough space in the narrative, and also it wasn't the central point. We talked more about, I think, and rightly so, the Helsinki Commission in the book about that.
Yeah.
But you also find, I think, that when you're doing interviews, one person leads to another. So when I talked to John Marks, for example, who lives in the Netherlands but worked for Case and was on his staff and heavily in the Vietnam period, he said, well, have you talked to this guy? Have you talked to this person? And they lead you to other individuals. Okay, like Mike Kraft, who is another assistant to Case and worked with him, and he was very involved with the Rhodesia issue and others. So I think you find that it's sort of a meandering road. You don't have an answer at the beginning. You have ideas and you develop them along the way. And Rutgers actually did me a big favor. I actually put a book proposal into Rutgers in 2009, and they said no.
Okay.
They said, and the external editor, the external reviewer said, you need to go to some presidential libraries and develop more of this. And they were absolutely right. They did me a favor. So 12 years later, we got the book proposal done and accepted.
And here it is in our hands, in my
That's
hands. Right. So we've got some nice questions that have come in, and I want to start. One of them is asked, what do you see as one of the most important achievements of Clifford Case as a U.S. Senator? Now that you've done all of this research, had the time to really analyze his time as a public servant, as a representative of New Jersey, the most important achievement you would say throughout his career as senator?
Well, I'll take it on two levels. I'll talk about legislation and then talk about what he represented.
Okay.
I think in legislation, his one sort of the one bill that's named after him, the Case-Jablonski Act, requires that the president give to Congress within 60 days any executive agreement. And while that sounds like an arcane thing, it really isn't, because the Foreign Relations Committee and the Intelligence Committees of the Senate and the House can't do anything if they don't know what the president's talking about with other countries.
Yeah.
And this was it remains a serious issue, because over the history of the country, the idea of advice and consent on treaties became far diminished, while presidents were making deals with other countries called executive agreements. And this is a major contentious issue with the Nixon administration. And finally, Nixon had to yield on this, but they were fighting it tooth and nail. I would say in terms of just the general principle of who he was, I think he stood for integrity. And one of the most significant things he did for New Jersey was his appointment of 3 prosecutors as the U.S. federal attorney: Frederick Lacy, Herbert Stern, and Jonathan Goldstein. They prosecuted and convicted over 100 officials in New Jersey, Democrats and Republicans, for corruption. Case referred to New Jersey's political corruption as a cesspool, and he said, we're going to try to clean it up, and he did.
Yeah.
Through those appointments.
Yeah. You reference, the integrity of the man, and I think also the importance he placed on relationships.
Yes.
And certainly here at Eagleton, we are often telling students, politics is about people, politics is about relationships. Can you give us a sense of the relationships he had while in Washington? Were there particular senators, members of the House of Representatives with whom he was particularly close? Did he have some, real personal allies, perhaps?
Well, I can talk about allies, and I can also talk about people he disagreed with.
Okay.
I interviewed Lucy Fusco, who is his personal secretary and who was the gatekeeper to his office. And I said, Lucy, who do you remember who the senator would associate with? And she said, well, Jacob Javits was a good friend, and so was Barry Goldwater. She said Jacob Javits was a horrible person, and Barry Goldwater was the nicest guy you could want to meet. Now, Case and Goldwater disagreed, I'd say, on 80% of policy. But in the Senate, as Ross Baker has pointed out, you have to trust people. And if you don't have trust, you don't have anything. And Case was trusted. And another person that I think he was very close to was Hubert Humphrey. In 1964, when Johnson asked Hubert Humphrey to manage the passage of the Civil Rights Act, Humphrey appointed Case and Joseph Clark as the dual floor managers, one Democrat, one Republican, for Title VII of the employment section of the Civil Rights Act. And Humphrey trusted the people who he appointed as those floor managers, but he and Case were close friends and respected one another greatly. And late in his life, when Humphrey was pretty sick and ill, dying of cancer, actually, there's a story one of his Case's staff members told me that one day Case walked into the weekly meeting and said, I don't know what we're going to do about Hubert. He keeps sending me legislation to co-sponsor. And everybody looked up, and Case sort of said, well, we'll just sign him, right? But everybody knew Humphrey was dying. And so the idea was that here's a man who trusted Clifford Case to support these ideas which he felt were good for the country. And so I think you see those relationships as absolutely critical. And I'll tell you one other thing. Charles Marchiante, who was the head of the AFL-CIO in New Jersey, and Case, of course, unlike many other Republicans, had strong bipartisan or strong organized labor support. I interviewed Charles Marchiante and I said, well, what was it like working with Case? He said, you didn't have to write anything down. A handshake was good enough. You knew, and if he shook your hand, that was the end of it. Good, you're done.
Wow. You referenced, I'm just looking at our questions here. We have a number of questions. We still have some time. If people have any more questions they want to submit, please do so. One of our questions mentions that later in your book, you mention an exchange that Clifford Case, Senator Case, had with who was Senator Joe Biden. So about the Mideast. Any thoughts right now, if you were sort of look at the Biden administration through the lens of Clifford Case, an assessment, perhaps, if you're looking at it from Case's eyes, an assessment of the administration?
Well, Clifford Case was a staunch supporter of Israel. From the time in 1948, the United States recognized Israel up until his death, actually, because he, and that particular thing you're talking about was in the Carter administration when they wanted to sell arms to Saudi Arabia. And Joe Biden introduced a resolution opposing it, but it still passed. I think Case would be very supportive of Israel, but not uncritical. I think he would take the position that Israel needs to understand what's happening to the Palestinians. He would definitely be opposed to Iran, though. He felt the United States actually didn't do a good job trying to make a better understanding with Iran before the 1979 revolution. He also felt that we had spent enough time on that issue. But I think today he would be very concerned about the theocracy in Iran and their use of terrorism.
You referenced earlier, support or lack thereof among Republicans here in New Jersey. And so one of the questions asked is, Republicans who thought he was too liberal think he could get elected as a conservative in New Jersey?
Today or then?
Let's say both.
Well, I think the evidence is pretty clear that Clifford Case would not run as a conservative. He ran as a thoughtful Republican who actually, if you look at the 54 election when he ran against Charles Howell for the Senate, he and Howell agreed on most of it, on policy. Where they differed was where I think Case was very supportive of Eisenhower, and Howell argued, no, we needed to have something else. But both Howell and Case agreed on the vast majority of policy issues. So I don't think he would have had Clifford Case run as a conservative. And I think this leads into another serious issue, which I attend to in the last part of the book, which is the failure of the liberal Republicans to develop a movement. The conservatives, after Goldwater's failure, never went away. They really started to build and continue to build an infrastructure to control the Republican Party. And as I point out, the last gasp of the liberals was Gerald Ford running for president in 1976, because Case and a bunch of others really worked hard to make sure that Reagan wouldn't get that election, would give him that nomination. But after that, basically, there is no continuing strength of liberal Republicans. They never built an infrastructure. They didn't build a Federalist Society. They didn't build a think tank or a movement, right? And so the conservatives did all that. But the liberal Republicans really relied on individuals, right? Charles Mathias was highly respected as a person. So was Case. But they didn't have a movement.
Can you help us understand, you spent some time towards the end about, I referenced that Senator Case served until he lost the GOP primary. Can you give us a little bit of a sense of, and some analysis on how do we understand why that happened, how that happened? To what extent did it have to do with the focus that the senator had on governance and the legislation, the work he was doing in Washington? Maybe was he taking seriously enough the threat of losing the primary? Give us a sense of understanding why he lost that primary.
Well, since 1960, he really hadn't had any difficulty beating back primary opponents in the Republican Party. So when Jeffrey Bell, who had been a Reagan speechwriter and worked with Reagan on the 76 challenge to Ford, comes to New Jersey specifically to run against him, I don't think he was taken very seriously by Case or by his staff, his administrative assistant, Francis Henderson. But Bell was a very aggressive campaigner, and he did something that I think a lot of people today take for granted. But it was one of the first times it had happened. Bell used a national solicitation program for direct mail that Richard Viguerie had pioneered. He raised most of his money by small donations nationwide, not from New Jersey. And so while Case was in Washington doing the business of the state and the country, Jeffrey Bell was going all over the state telling people that Clifford Case was too liberal. We needed supply side economics, go back to the gold standard. And he was raising a lot of money from people all over the country. You also see at that time, I think, Case belatedly recognizing the problem. Belatedly. Tom Kean made it clear to Case in a meeting early in that winter of 1978 that he thought Bell was more serious than Case thought. And initially, Case and Henderson sort of dismissed it, but then they finally did a poll, but they didn't do a poll that was broad-based enough. And I think the real analysis I have is that they took him too lightly. He didn't campaign enough in New Jersey. And by the way, Clifford Case was a very reluctant fundraiser. He didn't like to go and ask people for money, but he actually went out and raised $100,000 in one event. Henry Kissinger was the speaker in New Jersey, and and then Case had this money and didn't spend most of it. He used his traditional ads on radio and billboards, whereas Bell is going all over the state and he's meeting people. And really all Bell needed was to get enough conservatives who didn't like Case to come out to vote. And Case didn't get enough of his people to come out. And a lot of people, I think, felt he was going to win anyway. So I think it was a miscalculation on his part, and he lost by less than 4,000 votes.
And as you said, it really, in the ascendancy of a form of communication that the Republican Party, conservative Republicans in particular, really mastered at that period of time. One of our questions is asking about the base of support that Clifford Case had, looking at the demographics of who was supporting him throughout his tenure, and to what extent has that base migrated to the Democratic Party over the years in New Jersey?
Well, it's an interesting question, because if you look at the actual registration of New Jersey voters, it wasn't until about 1954 or 55 that Democrats outnumbered Republicans. People don't recognize, perhaps, that New Jersey was a pretty conservative state. And I think it was that shift that started to play a role then in changing the nature of the party affiliations in New Jersey. But it was only at the beginning in the 50s, in the mid 50s. Why did people support Clifford Case? I think there are three reasons. Number one, he was a moderate in many ways. And as the New York Times said on their sort of obituary editorial, they said he gave moderation a good name. So I think they didn't want extremes. And I still think in the New Jersey electorate today, you don't find much support for extremists. Number two, he had a lot of people who were Democrats and independents vote for him, particularly after the first term. Because if you look at his electoral votes, and his vote totals, he wins by a huge number of votes going forward, 60, 66, 72. That's not just Republicans. That's a lot of people who felt that he represented their interests. And as I said, organized labor, by 1972, he's actually getting the formal endorsement of the AFL-CIO. This is almost unheard of, right? For a Republican. So I think a third is that he delivered to New Jersey. You know, a lot of people thought he just dealt with Vietnam and foreign policy. That's not true at all. Not only with the 3 appointments for the anti-corruption attorneys, but he and Harrison Williams worked very closely to maintain military funding for bases in New Jersey, for redirecting money to New Jersey, and particularly on the environment. I mean, Case was really out there supporting ending ocean dumping off the shore, supporting conservation. And I think people respected that. You know, they expected when he got involved, New Jersey's interests will be supported.
Yeah.
And let me say one other thing.
Sure. You got it.
The Democrats had a hard time finding good candidates to run against him. I mean, if you look at who ran, in 1966, they were almost desperate, couldn't find anybody, and finally Warren relents, agrees to do it, and he gets crushed. 72, it's even worse. And so I think it's an issue that if Democrats had strong candidates and could draw upon their traditional constituencies, why didn't they do it? I think it's because Case was getting a lot of the votes.
Yeah. Give us a sense, Bill, you referenced it a bit in your intro, but tell us a little bit, you know, time is winding down a little bit. We have a little bit more time, but there were a lot of similarities between you and Clifford Case that sort of prompted you. Your background was similar, both Rutgers alums. Give us a sense of what prompted, you've told us about the process of doing the research. What made you write the book?
Well, I was doing research for what I was teaching at Hunterdon Central. I was dealing with lynching, an issue about lynching. And I read in Philip Dray's book about lynching that that Case was the last person to sponsor federal anti-lynching legislation. And that stuck out to me because I didn't realize that he was the guy. And then I got more into looking at it and I said, all right, well, his papers are at Rutgers. We can see what's there. But then I saw there are parallels, with my own life. I mean, I went to Rutgers, he went to Rutgers. I met my wife at Rutgers. He met Ruth at Rutgers. Is 54. They were married 54 years. He was in the band. I was in the band. It's an interesting parallel in some ways. But I think the other thing about it that was very interesting to me was that here is a person who I think provides a real alternative to what represents politics today. And I think we can learn from it. I really believe that this sort of crass and, in my view, very negative type of character assassination, whether it's on electronic media or on television or whatever it is, I don't think it serves the public very well. And as Ron Brownstein points out in his book, The Second Civil War, the center of American politics is so eroded today that if you want to get things done, you really need a guy like Clifford Case, right, in the middle. Because if everybody's on the periphery, well, then what can we agree on?
We're winding down. I have maybe one last question. I'm at an Institute of Politics. I'm at Rutgers University. We work with students all the time. We have a very engaged student population, but certainly nationally. Young adults in recent years have been increasing voter turnout rates. Have been, there's more to go, but young adults voter turnout rates are, upticking. Certainly, we've seen a lot of political activism, young adults really expressing their political voice on college campuses, but around the country. if Clifford Case were here, what case would he make, would Clifford Case make for running for office, for serving in office, for, as Teddy Roosevelt said, getting in the arena? What's the value of channeling that political activism into political leadership, civic leadership?
I think he would say you have to want to do good for the public. It's not a self-interest issue. It's not about promoting yourself. It's not about getting on television. It's about doing what's best for the public. And as his definition of politics that was quoted in the Central Jersey Home News points out, it's trying to preserve a republic that takes care of those who are at the weakest in society. That's a measure of, I think, a political system. That one of the things that they said about the people who were losing their jobs, the Liberal Republicans in the late 70s and early 80s, was that, well, when you lose a guy like Clifford Case and when you lose someone like Ed Brooke and others, who's going to stand up for those people? And I think that's a very important issue, because the levers of government can be turned to avarice and self-interest, or it can turn to the public good. And I think Clifford Case would say it's always important to serve the public good and do it in the right way.
And to take it one step further and connect it to the theme, the role of the party then. What is the role of the party then in accomplishing that?
I think the role of the political party is to do a good job establishing standards for officials that are going to be nominated. And I think that's a very important issue. And I think this whole controversy over the party line in New Jersey, I'm sure Clifford Case benefited from that when he ran, but I don't think today he'd believe it was a great idea. In fact, he opposed he actually came out and opposed the continuation of the Electoral College. He thought it should have been a direct vote. We should have no need for that. It's an antiquated system. But I think the important thing is that the political parties have to stand for something that goes beyond political power. They have to believe in something, and they have to believe in something that is meaningful for the public good. And I think he would say that.
Okay. Well, our time is winding down. I want to thank you, Bill, not only for the book. As I stated at the start, it's not just an important text, but it's really an important civics lesson for all of us. And not just residents of New Jersey, but beyond. So thank you for joining us tonight. Thank you for the book. Thank everyone who tuned in for joining us. This will be recorded. This has been recorded. You'll be able to access it on YouTube. Again, we thank you all for joining us and wish everyone a pleasant evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.